concessions, or other support from their position of power. The ends of both schemes were similar: to breed a crop of ethnically camouflaged spies who could blend into society anywhere North Korea needed them to. To this day, we do not know how successful these spies were. We do not know of any of these children actually being used for their intended purpose. It's possible the plan was scrapped, or that they've been so successful that no one ever caught them. North Korea only came clean about the abductions in 2002 as part of a new diplomatic chapter with Japan. Still, the numbers they confessed to taking, no more than 13, are much lower than the numbers that survivors and others suggest. Just 5 of the abductees were returned to Japan later that year, and the fates of dozens of other missing people and their children are unknown. Rangoon bombing. North Korea's criminal behavior seemed to get worse in the 1980s, perhaps reflecting the newfound influence of Kim Jong-il. 2 horrendous terrorist attacks on foreign soil shocked the world in that decade, and increasingly isolated the DPRK. The first was an attempted assassination of the South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan during a visit to Rangoon, modern-day Yangon, in Burma. On the 9th of October, 1983, Chun, along with a host of other South Korean officials and advisors, was due to attend a wreath-laying ceremony at the Martyrs' Mausoleum, dedicated to several Burmese national heroes. At 10:25 a.m., just before the ceremony was due to start, a bomb hidden in the building by North Korean agents exploded. The blast destroyed the memorial, killing 21 people and wounding 46. Among the dead were several high-ranking South Korean officials, including the foreign minister and the deputy prime minister, along with journalists and Burmese civilians. Luckily for President Chun, his car had been caught up in traffic, and he escaped unharmed. North Korea was an obvious suspect, and police quickly identified 3 North Korean military officers who had secretly entered Yangon and received a package from a North Korean diplomatic mission, which was later found to have been explosives. Police closed in, but the suspects did not go easily. One suspect was killed in a firefight with police after taking down 3 police officers. The remaining 2 were captured after attempting to kill themselves with a grenade. One of these men, Kang Min-chul, avoided the death penalty by confessing the details of the crime and implicating the regime. The Rangoon bombing shattered North Korean relations with multiple countries, especially Myanmar, who were appalled that they would attempt not only to murder the leader of South Korea, but to do so at a secret site within a neutral country. 1987 Korean Air Flight 858. The second and far worse crime occurred 4 years later aboard South Korean Air Flight 858. On the 29th of November, 1987, 2 North Korean agents working on Kim Jong-il's orders boarded Flight 858, using false Japanese passports and speaking Japanese taught to them by some of the captured Japanese citizens. The plane was flying from Baghdad to Seoul, with several stopovers in between. The agents secretly planted an explosive device disguised in an electronic radio in the luggage storage above their seats, then left the plane when it stopped over in Abu Dhabi. The plane continued on its journey, unaware of the deadly package it carried. A few hours later, the bomb detonated over the Andaman Sea in Southeast Asia, killing all 115 people on board. The agents tried to flee through the Middle East, but were caught in Bahrain. They both tried to commit suicide, but only one succeeded. The survivor, a woman named Kim Hyun-hwae, was detained and quickly linked to the attack. Investigation and interrogation soon revealed the truth. Kim Hyun-hwae had been taken from a young age and forced through North Korea's spy program, trained to be completely loyal to the regime. Kim Jong-il personally ordered her and her partner to bomb the plane to scare South Korea and frighten people away from the upcoming 1988 Olympics in Seoul. For her part, Kim Hyun-hwae was sentenced to death, but she was pardoned by the South Korean government, who argued that the indoctrinated girl was as much a victim of the regime as anyone else. It was a controversial decision, and Hyun-hwae lives with constant security out of fear of revenge from the victims' families or the North Korean government to this day. She has since denounced the regime and appears to be genuinely remorseful, but the decision to let her off the hook has angered many people. The murder of 115 people aboard Flight 858 was one of the most egregious acts of violence committed by North Korea since the Korean War. The international community was outraged, and the US officially declared North Korea a terrorist state. Of course, North Korea officially denies that it had anything to do with it, but the evidence against them is unquestionable. Mega projects. Clearly, the 1980s were a decade of external problems. Pyongyang tried to distract from these issues by funding massive internal projects to placate the people. Some of these projects were genuinely useful, others were mere exercises in vanity, and some turned out to be miserable failures. The Nampo Dam on the west coast of the country was the great internal achievement of the decade. Built between 1981 and 1986, this massive $4 billion tidal barrage separates the Taedong River from the Yellow Sea. It prevents seawater contamination of the river, allowing it to be used to supply water for human, industrial, and agricultural needs. It is undeniably a feat of engineering and is still a proud icon of regime propaganda, and a popular tourist destination to boot. But while the Nampo Dam had a purpose, the Juche Tower did not. The Juche Tower is a 560-foot-tall monument to the regime's ideology in Pyongyang. It makes for a pretty sight, and it was an impressive 70th birthday gift to Kim Il-sung. But it was little more than a monument to the cult of the Kim Dynasty. Then again, at least it was completed, unlike Pyongyang's other flagship 1980s project, the Rugyong Hotel. This 1,000-foot-tall pyramid skyscraper towers above the city skyline and was supposed to be an icon of a modernizing North Korea. It was planned to have restaurants, guest rooms, casinos, and lounges, all to attract foreign visitors and, crucially, foreign investment. What North Korea actually got was an endless money pit where construction and planning problems led the project to be abandoned. It was started in 1987, intended for Kim Il-sung's 80th birthday in 1992, but it was abandoned and is unfinished to this day. It was meant to be a monument to the nation's greatness, but instead, it stands as a symbol to the vanity and wastefulness of a regime that would waste billions on vanity projects while their countrymen sink into poverty. The collapse of global communism. Change hit the world hard and fast, and for all of its isolation, even North Korea would feel the effects. Under Gorbachev, Moscow became increasingly skeptical of North Korea and tried to push it to roll back its totalitarian control. Moscow's first formal delegation to Seoul in 1987 was also a disaster for the North's hard line against the South, and it forced Pyongyang to start its own process of diplomatic engagement with the South in the years after. Under Deng Xiaoping, China also rolled back its aggressive state control of the economy and embraced limited economic liberalization. This led China to open up to the West, leaving North Korea to become something of an embarrassing irritant to them. Beijing did not abandon its old ally, and economic aid continued, but diplomatic support for North Korea was less vocal as China sought a new place in the world diplomatic and economic order. Meanwhile, the rapid disintegration of the USSR in 1991 was as much of a surprise to its allies as to its enemies, and cut off a major ally for North Korea. As global communism collapsed, North Korea withdrew into itself. The regime re-anchored itself in Juche, insisting that North Korea's self-reliance was the key that would allow the nation to survive, while other communist countries failed. Given China's liberalization and Gorbachev's opening to the West, Pyongyang probably wasn't wrong on this point. Opening itself up to new ideas could well have been fatal for North Korea's totalitarian regime, and so the hermit nation doubled down on its isolation. Nuclear North Korea. The increasingly rogue North Korea sought protection in nuclear weapons. But even there, the new realities of world politics were clear. The North had been eyeing nuclear technology for decades. It had nuclear power plants, largely thanks to Soviet support, but it was still a long way from making nuclear weapons of its own. In the 1990s, the US began putting increasing pressure on North Korea to open up its reactors to international inspectors. In theory, North Korea's interest in nuclear technology was purely for energy purposes. The loss of fuel supplies and subsidies from the USSR had compromised the country's energy sector, but the risk of them repurposing it for nuclear weapons was obvious. Better, Washington argued, to stop them before they can repurpose that material into weapons than wait for them to do it. When the North suddenly withdrew from the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in March 1993, it triggered the first global nuclear scare of the post-Cold War world. There were talks of nuclear war, and a North Korean diplomat threatened that his nation would, quote, turn Seoul into a sea of fire. Like every North Korean nuclear scare, the boasting came to nothing. They didn't have the will or weapons to follow through. Furthermore, a U.S. delegation led by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter arrived in 1994 and managed to convince Kim Il-sung to scale back the nuclear program if the U.S. agreed to provide safer, non-weaponizable alternatives for the DPRK's energy needs. For a moment, it looked like North Korea's path might change. The world had forced a readjustment. The DPRK had agreed to international help, and Western help at that, for a critical part of its economy. Even better, Kim agreed to host a meeting with the South Korean president in Pyongyang in late July 1994, an unprecedented diplomatic gesture. It was a glimpse of hope, the potential for a more cooperative North Korea. But that glimpse wouldn't last, and neither would Kim Il-sung. Death of the Great Leader. Just before noon on the 7th of July, 1994, 82-year-old Kim Il-sung collapsed at his private residence in Gyeongsang province. He'd suffered a massive heart attack. The best doctors in the country were flown in to help him, but in the early hours of July 8th, the great leader of North Korea was declared dead. The state had secretly been preparing for his death for years. Arrangements for national announcements, public mourning, and an elaborate funeral were already in place. Still, tradition demanded that his death only be announced 34 hours later. Every North Korean remembers where they were when they heard the news of his death. Neighbors gathered around the only TV in the street to hear the news. Students were called together so the announcement could be made to the whole school. Production lines halted as the news spread through the factories. The 34,000 statues of Kim Il-sung dotted around the country became pilgrimage points for a nation consumed with grief. From the outside, the outpouring of grief for Kim Il-sung's death seems bizarre. Was it all for show? A performative act by people who knew they could be punished for not seeming sad enough? Or was it all genuine? A sign of the thorough brainwashing that North Korea had been subjected to by Kim's regime for the last 40 years? Eyewitnesses vary on their answer. Many people in North Korea had never known life outside of the cult of the Kim dynasty, and the loss of the great leader was an emotional blow that upended their worldview. There were others, of course, who saw him as a tyrant, even if they couldn't voice it. They knew what had happened to friends, colleagues, and family members who had dared criticize him in the past. Supposedly, Kim Il-sung's elaborate state funeral attracted 2 million people to Pyongyang. Video footage showed weeping crowds falling to their knees as the convoy rolled past. Women collapsed into the arms of their husbands as they visited Kim lying in state. Again, it is impossible to draw the line between what was real and what was for show. One person who was definitely on show was Kim Jong-il. For him, the funeral of his father was the first official act of his new regime. Kim was laid to rest in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun in a glass coffin, where his embalmed body can still be seen by visitors today. He was also made eternal president of the People's Republic, a symbol of his continual presence in the political and ideological life of North Korea. Reflecting on Kim Il-sung. With Kim's death, a new chapter of the nation's history was about to begin, but we cannot proceed without taking a moment to reflect on the man's life. Modern historians like to move away from the stories of great men, but Kim Il-sung was undeniably a special figure. His personality cult and practical power made him the most important person in his nation for half a century, and he used that influence to reshape the lives of millions of people. Few people ever live such an impactful life. Kim must have been disappointed. Despite his efforts to hide it, North Korea had fallen behind its southern enemies in prosperity, industry, technology, education, diplomacy, and more. The dreams of reunification seemed like a distant memory as Western military technology continued to eclipse their outdated Soviet-era weapons. Newfound diplomatic avenues between North and South showed that the North was starting to accept that its neighbor was here to stay. The continued economic rise of the capitalist nations, the liberalization of China, and the collapse of the USSR painted a grim picture for Kim's beloved Marxist-Leninist ideology. Many would say it was good riddance. Kim Il-sung directly or indirectly caused the deaths of millions of people between his wars, death camps, firing squads, and famines. For every person shedding a tear in the streets of Pyongyang, there were probably many more around the world celebrating the demise of one of the century's most brutal dictators. But if anyone hoped that the great leader's death would improve things in North Korea, they were about to be sorely disappointed. The reign of Kim Jong-il. The legend of Kim Jong-il. Kim Il-sung's death was rather sudden, but Kim Jong-il's rise had been anything but. Kim Jong-il had held an important place in the operation and propaganda of the regime for years. However, he was not his father. He lacked the true revolutionary pedigree and exciting life story of Kim Il-sung. If he was going to inspire the same loyalty and enthusiasm, his propaganda machine would have to work even harder. As a result, North Korean propaganda churned ridiculous stories about Il's life and skills to make up for his rather uninspiring life story. It was said he was born on a sacred mountain, and a new star appeared in the sky to mark his birth, or that his mood could change the weather. According to the propaganda, Kim was a creator and an innovator. He wrote hundreds of movie scripts and operas during his life, on top of the many ideological works that flowed from his pen, like scriptures from the hands of a prophet. But maybe his greatest creation came in the 2000s, when he invented a reward for outstanding students: a piece of meat stuck between two pieces of bread. The West quickly ripped off this stunning innovation and called it a hamburger, but North Korea knows the real truth. Kim was also a peerless sportsman. During his first game of bowling, he hit a perfect 300. Then, of course, there was his legendary golfing talent. Kim hit 11 holes in one in his first round of golf in Pyongyang, and he was so good that he decided to never play again. Why would he need to, when he was already the best in the world? Even his toilet habits were mythologized, or his lack thereof. According to the government, Kim Jong-il never needed to use the toilet or attend to the basic bodily needs that mere mortals dealt with every day. It's likely that North Korean propaganda is bending the truth a little bit. In reality, very little is known about Kim Jong-il's private life. He possessed multiple mistresses and had at least 6 children, although more might have existed out of public view. Despite his image as a staunch North Korean patriot, his undying love of Western films was a poorly kept secret of his private life, and one of the only things we really know about his life behind closed doors. The propaganda made the new Kim out to be extraordinary, but reality was ready to put that to the test. The North Korean famine. Between debt, isolation, energy issues, and economic stagnation, it would have taken an extraordinary man to meet the challenges facing North Korea, and the new Kim did not measure up. The North's underlying collectivization policy kept the country on a knife's edge at the best of times. Therefore, when flooding caused crop failures across the nation in 1994, and with food aid from the USSR long gone, North Korea fell into a dreadful famine, which the regime euphemistically called the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands of people began to starve. Social order broke down. The black market, already a ubiquitous feature of North Korean life, became a lifeline for malnourished families who were easily exploited. Many people were forced to migrate in desperate search for food. This was technically illegal, as the law required most people to have a permit to leave their town. But so many people had no other choice that there was no practical way to enforce the law. There were food riots in Hamhung and Sinuiju, and in some cities, roaming gangs of starving orphans took to the streets in desperate search of food. The famine had political consequences too. A group of senior military officers headquartered in Hamhung City, one of the worst affected areas, held secret meetings in autumn 1995. They discussed the idea of overthrowing Kim for his failures to address the crisis. State security services found out about the meetings, however, and all of the officers were arrested and shot. Kim Jong-il was characteristically evasive about the issue. In a December 1996 speech, Kim downplayed the famine as a food problem and was more concerned about the party's reputation than the suffering of his people. He blamed local party officials for failing to properly educate the masses in socialist ideas, which made them less loyal and was leading to social breakdown. He lamented that, quote, "the food problem is creating a state of anarchy," but failed to offer any real solutions to this crisis. Kim was even reluctant to accept food aid from China because he felt it weakened and degraded his country. The Shimwa-jo and the end of famine. In 1997, drought extended the famine for another year, but as the famine raged, Kim Jong-il kept scrambling to protect the regime's reputation. Kim made it illegal to utter the words famine or starvation in public or private. Violators could expect a visit from the Shimwa-jo, a secret police force established in 1996 to target those who tarnished the government's image amidst the famine. No one was safe from the Shimwa-jo. The agricultural secretary of the party was executed by firing squad on their orders. The general party secretary was tortured to death, and numerous provincial and municipal party leaders disappeared, never to be seen again. In all, over 10,000 people were killed, and another 15,000 were put into concentration camps by this shadowy organization. Despite their efforts to hide it, though, international observers and NGO workers soon exposed the extent of the crisis. By the late 90s, Pyongyang was forced to accept food aid, which finally brought the crisis under control, but not before countless people had perished. Pyongyang's official estimate is that 220,000 people died during the famine. International observers insist it was higher, anywhere between 600,000 and 3.5 million. The Battle of Yeonpyeong Island. The famine might explain one of the biggest skirmishes between North and South since the armistice. North Korea was always unhappy with the armistice's naval boundary that gave South Korea control over several islands and valuable fishing spots in the Yellow Sea. With North Koreans starving, those fishing grounds looked awfully tempting to the regime. In June 1999, North Korea sent out small fleets of patrol and fishing boats across the naval boundary near Yeonpyeong Island. Naturally, South Korea responded with their own patrols, but neither side wanted to restart the war over some fish. For several days, North Korean ships would cross the boundary, antagonize the South Koreans, and then retreat back. Each time, both sides sent a few more ships, and started to bring in heavily armed torpedo boats to intimidate their opponents. After a week of this, South Korea launched a bumping offensive. Basically, the ships started ramming each other. This carried on for a few days and ships on both sides were damaged. It was risky, since accidentally sinking a ship could make things worse, or one of the military ships could panic and turn it into a shooting offensive instead. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened on the 15th of June. A North Korean patrol boat panicked after being surrounded by South Korean ships and opened fire with its cannons. The South Koreans shot back, and for 15 minutes, the war was back on. In the end, one North Korean ship was sunk, and 5 others were badly damaged. At least 17 North Korean sailors died, but the South Koreans only had a few minor injuries. The North Koreans limped back to safety. The Battle of Yeonpyeong Island was over, but the peninsula braced itself for the consequences and a potential restart of the war. Fortunately, nothing came of it. North Korea had learned its lesson for now. North Korea propaganda told the people that they had won a tremendous victory and sunk at least 10 South Korean battleships, and then quickly buried the event. Songun. The Battle of Yeonpyeong Island was a poor showing for the DPRK, which must have stung for Kim Jong-il. Although he never served on the front line himself, Il was obsessed with the military. He had been appointed to the Military Commission in 1980 and had been made Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army in 1991, giving him years of prior experience overseeing military affairs. Kim's enthusiasm for the military was expressed through his ideal of Songun, or military first. Kim placed the military at the center of public life, ramping up military propaganda and placing its needs at the top of government priority lists. By Songun's logic, it was the military, not the common people, who acted as vanguards for the revolution, and it was they who were the key to North Korea's long-term survival. The military became the model for all of society. Military discipline, obedience, and loyalty were to be emulated by all people in all aspects of North Korean life. Propaganda recentered the soldier and cast all citizens as soldiers in the endless war against the DPRK's enemies. Free markets in North Korea. Kim didn't neglect the economy either, but his indecisiveness and ineffectiveness did little to help anyone. Songun itself did provide some economic improvement. There were plenty of jobs to be had in upgrading the military, not to mention in conscription, but those alone weren't enough to address the country's obvious economic shortcomings. In 2002, international observers were shocked to see North Korea seemingly embrace market economics with the July 1st measures. Among a number of things, the July 1st measures adjusted the price of rice to follow the market, gave companies and managers greater freedom to purchase supplies in that market, and worked to establish official private markets for goods and services inside the DPRK. While hailed as a major reform in foreign media, in reality, the laws were little more than a legalization of black market trade that had been happening for years. They were an acknowledgement of the country's underlying problems, not a solution to them. The illusion of a new economic turn was furthered in 2004 with the opening of the Kaesong Industrial Park. This was a joint endeavor by North and South to improve economic ties. The Kaesong Park sits about 10 miles north of the demilitarized zone and allowed South Korean companies to employ North Korean labor to produce their goods. The wages were paid directly to the government, giving the North a useful source of foreign currency in exchange for cheap labor for the Southern companies. Although small in scale, it was a productive diplomatic step for the two Koreas, and was an unusually direct attempt by Pyongyang to harness the power of capitalist business practices. Despite the hope of foreign observers, these changes were not as significant as foreign media presented them, and Pyongyang quickly got cold feet. After a few years, they clamped down hard on market training, banning all working-age men and later all women under 50 from participating in it. These bans probably didn't have much real effect on black market trading, but it signaled that Kim Jong-il had not suddenly become a fan of free market economics. George Bush and the Axis of Evil. As North Korea entered the new millennium, it found itself increasingly villainized by the world. After 2000, the Bush administration took an increasingly firm line on Pyongyang and turned up their rhetoric. North Korea also faced renewed scrutiny from an international community that saw it as a relic of times past. One driver of this new scrutiny was Lee Soon-ok, a defector who had spent 5 years in a North Korean concentration camp. Her 1999 memoir told tales of forced labor, the torture of prisoners, mandatory abortions, and public executions. In 2002, as part of the Bush administration's harder line on North Korea, she was invited to speak to the US Congress about her experiences there, holding up the dark underbelly of Kim's Korea for the world to see. In 2002, Bush described North Korea, alongside Iraq and Iran, as an axis of evil. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the US was wary of rogue states like the DPRK sponsoring attacks on American civilians. Given Kim Jong-il's involvement with terror attacks, such as the bombing of Flight 858, it wasn't an unreasonable concern. The US's allies joined in its caution towards Pyongyang, and neither Russia nor China was strong enough to be an alternative ally to challenge the US, as they had during the Cold War. Nuclear North Korea. It's perhaps no surprise that Kim Jong-il continued his country's nuclear program amidst this hostility. The 1994 nuclear agreement spearheaded by Jimmy Carter failed to prevent North Korea continuing its nuclear missile development. The Clinton administration had tried to engage Pyongyang in negotiations to stall the development of ballistic missiles, but achieved very little, and Kim Jong-il became skilled at using the nuclear program as leverage to gain more economic aid. By 2002, the CIA believed North Korea possessed at least one nuclear weapon and had the capacity to create even more. However, the first known successful detonation didn't occur until October 2006. Reality still constrained Kim, though. His nuclear weapons would not solve the energy or economic crises afflicting his country. Pyongyang ultimately needed a functioning nation more than they needed nuclear weapons. And so, in 2007, after multiple conferences with the US, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and China, North Korea agreed to suspend its weapons program and shut down its main nuclear reactor at Yongbyon in exchange for diplomatic concessions and massive amounts of fuel and economic aid. It was a short-lived concession. The North refused to accept international observers to inspect its reactors, and continued to test rockets that could be capable of delivering nuclear payloads. When the UN sanctioned them, the DPRK announced it was resuming its weapons program and reactor operations in full capacity. The One Retaliation Crisis of 2009. The biggest stumble of Kim's regime probably came with the disastrous money reforms in 2009. That year, Pyongyang had the bright idea of reforming the currency. It was standard fare for a communist regime, announced that all existing banknotes will be taken out of circulation and made worthless, and people have a short window to exchange them for new banknotes. However, Pyongyang set daily limits on how much currency people could exchange, which meant that most people would lose money by being unable to convert it in the short time frame. This was intentional. The regime wanted to reduce the money supply to reduce inflation, while wiping out illegal savings made by black marketeers and other criminals. The end goal was for the new 1 won to buy as much as the old 100 won. But economics is not that simple, especially not with Kim Jong-il at the helm. It seems that Kim Jong-il felt the reforms would punish loyal workers. After all, why should they lose money under the reforms? He had a solution. Every government employee, which meant almost everyone in the country, would keep the same numerical wage after the reforms as before. Of course, since 1 won would be worth 100 times more after the reforms, Kim was basically increasing nearly every wage in the country by 10,000%. Obviously, this was a catastrophe. The reforms produced confusion, chaos, and colossal inflation. Prices soared. The government tried to control them, but reality forced people to ignore the price caps. The regime was forced to close markets and shops to try and rein things in. Economic confusion and panic produced shortages of basic goods. These reforms affected everyone from peasants to generals. And perhaps for the first time ever, the idea that the regime might be overthrown became a real possibility. Foreign students remembered North Koreans openly complaining about the policy, and one North Korean diplomat angrily told a foreign representative that the government, quote, doesn't understand what it's doing. Never had criticism of the regime by its own citizens been so public or so widespread. By April of 2010, however, conditions had stabilized. As people figured out the actual value of money, the economy started to function properly again. Soon after, the government rolled back almost all bans on market activity and explicitly ordered local authorities not to intervene in markets except to deal with illegal goods. The revaluation debacle was almost certainly Kim Jong-il's doing. One historian described him as comically incompetent on economic issues, and only he could have proposed such an obviously stupid plan without anyone criticizing it. Several high-ranking officials, including the head of economic policy in the KWP, were scapegoated and executed or arrested, and the regime quickly buried the event and denied anything bad happened. It might not be the most exciting episode in North Korean history, but it might well be the closest the regime came to collapsing from within. Skirmishes with South Korea. Internal problems did not stop North Korea creating external problems for itself, though. Kim apparently hadn't let go of the dispute over fishing grounds in the Yellow Sea that had spilled over into skirmishes early into his reign. North and South again exchanged fire over fishing rights off Daecheong Island in November 2009, resulting in an uncertain number of North Korean casualties. Given the tension in the area, it was natural for South Korea to keep ships nearby. One of those ships was the ROKS Cheonan. On the night of the 26th of March 2010, the Cheonan was suddenly rocked by an explosion. The shocked crew scrambled to save her, but within 10 minutes, the ship had broken in half and sunk just off the coast of Baekneung Island. 46 of its 104 crew drowned. South Korean officials scrambled for an explanation. There were no reports of conflict or North Korean ships in the area. An extensive investigation eventually determined that a North Korean torpedo had detonated beneath the ship. Fragments of the torpedo were recovered, and it was concluded that a small North Korean submarine had fired on them. Pyongyang denied the accusation and was supported by both China and Russia. Counter-arguments claimed that the Cheonan had collided with the sea floor and caused damage that led to the sudden explosion, or that it had struck a sea mine. Several academic studies have failed to settle on an explanation, but South Korea and its allies continue to believe that North Korea was responsible. The sinking of the Cheonan caused relations to nosedive, and rhetoric on both sides heated up in the following years. These tensions led to another engagement between North and South at Yongpyong Island. When South Korean forces performed naval exercises around the disputed island, North Korea fired almost 200 artillery shells at homes and military installations, which killed 4 people and injured around 20. The South fired back and killed 10 North Korean soldiers before both sides ceased fire. The North blamed the South for provoking them with military exercises, while the South insisted that the North bore full responsibility for opening fire without just cause. It is possible that the North was trying to make a statement against South Korea's admittance to the G20 earlier in 2010. Whatever the reason for the attack, it's likely Kim Jong-il himself was involved. He had visited one of the artillery bases where shells had been fired from the day before, and such a blatant provocation would have needed high-level approval. But if Kim Jong-il really was committed to armed provocation, then South Korea was about to catch a lucky break. Death of a dictator. In 2011, death once again struck the Kim regime without warning. On the 19th of December, the government announced the sudden death of Kim Jong-il from a heart attack 2 days earlier.
김정일 동지께서 주체 100 2011년 12월 17일 8시 30분에 현지 지도의 길에서
It claimed he'd been traveling aboard his personal train when he suffered the fatal attack. South Korean intelligence was skeptical of this claim, since their spies reported that his train hadn't moved around the time of his death. But whatever the real circumstances of his death were, have been completely buried by the regime. As with his father's death, the DPRK was consumed with scenes of grief and distress. Crowds wept as they listened to the announcement, and his funeral was an elaborate spectacle for the tearful masses. Once again, how sincere these displays were is up for debate. Kim Jong-il had officially ruled for less than half the length of his father's reign, and unlike his father, had not thrown out any Japanese occupiers or waged any wars against its great enemies. Il's reign was also one of clear economic deprivation, of famine, and of North Korea's further decline into a pariah state, and even the laughingstock of the international community, who only got taken seriously when it threatened to destroy the world. Promises it almost certainly couldn't back up. Still, the propaganda machine didn't slow down for his death any more than it did for his life. According to the regime, storms paused and the sky glowed red at the moment of his death. He was given the posthumous internal title of Grand Marshal, a symbol of his focus on the military and a sign of how important the military had become to the regime under his leadership. It was time for a new Kim to take